Hey everybody, we need to have a talk. As many of you know, this week, Ken Burns' long-awaited documentary on the American Revolution has been airing on PBS, and I know many of you have seen it. Many of you have been looking forward to it, and I have made the mistake, yet again, of going to social media, and I've been interacting with people, many of them prominent people with a lot of followers, who have been letting their thoughts be known about the series and what they think it is doing wrong. The word I see being thrown around a lot is, of course, woke. I see DEI being thrown a lot out there, things like that. So I felt like this was a good time for us to have a chat, to have a talk about this. I make no secret of my own biases and things of that nature, but I also make no secret of the fact, over and over and over again, if there's one thing I harp on when I'm talking about history with the folks in this community, it's that history is never, ever, ever black and white. It's nuance. It's shades of gray. We want to make heroes and villains out of people. We want to make good guys and bad guys, and most of the time that's just not the case. And that's true with this story. The main complaint that I'm seeing is that a number of people seem to take exception with the amount of time that is being focused on issues with Native American tribes, particularly the Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Delaware, others. I've had people tell me it's a side quest and it distracts from what's important. It distracts from the real story, which is the Patriots fighting for independence against the British. And I'm here to tell you right now, if you think that that's the only story of the revolution, then you're missing a massive, massive chunk of why the revolution happened in the first place and how the revolution was fought and what the settlement afterwards meant. You cannot separate issues with Native Americans and issues with the enslavement of African Americans. You cannot separate those issues from the revolution because they are at the core of why the revolution was fought, of how it was fought, and in what happened afterwards. So I just want to talk through a little bit of that because I want us to understand that this is not a side quest. This is the main focus of what the revolution was about. Yes, the revolution was fought over issues of taxation without representation, over issues of the aftermath of the French and Indian War. But let's back up and let's go to the French and Indian War. Let's talk about this. Because after the French and Indian War, the traditional narrative that we usually talk about in the United States is that the crown went into great debt defending the colonies against the French and their native allies, and therefore had to recoup those funds through a series of taxes that we talk a lot about. And that's all true. But an equally, if not more important aspect of the aftermath of the French and Indian War is that a line was drawn in a proclamation in 1763 that said, here's a line, and settlement can't cross that line to go into Native American territory. Basically, if you want to just roughly imagine the Appalachian Mountains as that line. That's why when you look at maps of Pennsylvania and Georgia and North Carolina, they don't look like they do in modern times because at that point they could only go so far. When France was kicked out of North America, part of the agreement was that these native confederacies in the West were going to be left alone because the crown couldn't afford to fight another war against many of those tribes when they were allied together. And so they said, we'll leave you alone, you leave us alone. That was the agreement. And from the beginning, from that time up through the Revolution, many of our founding fathers, men like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Patrick Henry, these were men who had a strong interest in westward expansion. Heck, George Washington was out there doing surveys of land that was off limits according to the Proclamation of 1763 because nobody thought that that was going to hold. And it was always an important factor in the Revolution was the ability to spread west and to have more land that would become available, the early form of manifest destiny. So when the Declaration of Independence is written, a key phrase that we don't like to often read in the Declaration of Independence isn't just about taxes. It accuses King George III of bringing on, quote, merciless Indian savages to kill colonists. From day one, the American Republic defined itself by opposition from some of those tribes and by a desire to take that land. One of the ways that we got people to sign up to fight in the Revolution was the promise that after the war, all this new land that right now is off limits to us, we're going to be able to settle that land. Land in what is now Tennessee and Kentucky and Ohio and Indiana and those places. And so they were promised land grants. And I speak that as somebody who has 47 direct ancestors. These are like great-great-great-great-grandfathers, 47 who fought in the Revolution. Many of them for the promise of land. The reason I have so many is because my family tree runs through Kentucky. Who settled eastern Kentucky after the Revolution? It was Revolutionary War veterans who got land grants for their service in land that had previously been promised to remain in Native American hands. About half of my Revolutionary War ancestors spent significant time not fighting against the British, but fighting against Native Americans on the western frontier. We cannot think of the American Revolution as a war between patriots and the British. There was a massive, massive amount of Native Americans fighting on both sides, but mostly for the British in this war. And that's why by the time you get a couple of years into the war, you have serious issues being dealt with by the patriots, by the Americans, against the Native Americans. That's why the Sullivan expedition happens. George Washington sends General Sullivan into western New York, into the Finger Lakes region, some of those areas, not to defeat armies, but to destroy villages and destroy crops. They destroy 50 Iroquois and allied native tribes, villages, 50. They destroy hundreds of thousands of bushels of corn. They destroy orchards. They uproot plants. They destroy everything. Think of the March to the Sea during the American Civil War, only multiply it several times over. That's what's happening. They're not just destroying their ability to make war. They're destroying their ability to live there. And it drives many of them over into Canada and into the Buffalo and over in the Niagara region. But this happens again in the South. The same thing happens during the Southern campaign, where Patriot militia are sent over into the mountains to destroy Cherokee villages, and dozens more Cherokee villages are destroyed. Listen, it is not patriotic to ignore this stuff. It's idiotic. It's idiotic, and I said this on social media, because if we ignore the fact that this stuff happened, it makes it more likely that it can happen again. I'm not trying to say that Native Americans didn't. Listen, Native Americans were also raiding into patriots, and this is one of the reasons why George Washington sends the Sullivan expedition, because Native Americans were raiding into and killing civilian white people as well. It was happening on both sides. But to ignore the fact that the fight against Native Americans was a major, major component of the Revolution, and to ignore the fact that westward expansion into Indian lands was a major motivation for independence, is to ignore reality and to ignore history. It is not patriotic to ignore history. It is perfectly acceptable to be an American who is proud of your country, but also acknowledges that, you know what, sometimes Americans did terrible things. The Gnadenhutten massacre here in northeastern Ohio, we've talked about it, we've done an entire video about that, was not something to be proud of. This was Pennsylvania militia marching into Ohio, going to a peaceful, Christian, civilized Native American group of Moravian Indians in Gnadenhutten. And not just kind of in the heat of battle wiping them out. They actually sat down, took a vote, and the next morning bashed the heads and the brains out and executed and stabbed and shot and did all sorts of things to men, women, and children. These were Christians. These were civilized Native Americans, and they were murdered by Patriot militia. Ignoring those kinds of things is not reality. It is not history. And the people who are saying it's a side quest, no, it's not. This is a major, major component of the American Revolution. Some of the last battles of the American Revolution, like the Battle of Blue Licks, Kentucky, where my fifth great grandfather was killed, was a battle against primarily Native Americans. The Battle of Oriskany, one of the bloodiest battles of the Revolution, was primarily fought by Native Americans. These are things that we have to talk about. And the issue of slavery is an important part too. When George Washington retakes possession of New York City in November of 1783, one of the first things that happens is that we round up all of the African Americans who had been given their freedom from slavery by the British, and we re-enslave them. Okay, 3,000 black soldiers were supposed to be trained and equipped and put into the field. That's a massive amount of troops in the Revolution. John Lawrence wanted to equip and train and as a condition of gaining freedom, enlist black soldiers. They would get freedom after the war if they fought. The government shot it down, said absolutely not, we're not arming blacks because they might think that then they can have their freedom and that might lead to a slave revolt. These are things that are important to talk about, as are the things like the Declaration of Independence and taxation without representation and the important desires of self-governance that the American patriots wanted to have. You cannot separate one from the other. To tell the story of the Revolution without telling the story of these fights against Native American tribes on the Western frontier is to ignore a massive chunk of what happened. So listen, I'm not saying that Ken Burns doesn't lean on the liberal side of politics. He absolutely does, and I don't think there's any secret there with that. I don't lean on that side, and I agree with him on how this story is being told. It's important to tell that story. I hope you understand that. If you have any questions about it, I'd be glad to answer them. But let's not, in our desire to be patriotic, in our desire to love our country, act like our country hasn't been capable of terrible things at times. It doesn't make America less great. It just means that America is like most human beings. We have warts, we have scars, we have things in our past that we could look back on and say, you know what? Yeah, it kind of sucked that we did that, and we shouldn't have. And moving forward, we need to be better. It's okay to do that. Thanks for listening.